In this video, we are going to talk about the Bible, the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Specifically, we're going to talk about chapters and verses in the Old Testament of the Bible. In Genesis, we have 50 chapters, 1533 verses, and an average of 31 verses per chapter. Exodus, we have 40 chapters, 1213 verses, and an average of 30 verses per chapter. Leviticus, we have 27 chapters, 859 verses, and an average of 32 verses per chapter. Numbers, we have 36 chapters, 1288 verses, and an average of 36 verses per chapter. Deuteronomy, we have 34 chapters, 959 verses, and an average of 28 verses per chapter. Joshua, we have 24 chapters, 658 verses, and an average of 27 verses per chapter. Judges, 21 chapters, 618 verses, 29 verses per chapter. Ruth, 4 chapters, 85 verses, 21 verses per chapter. 1 Samuel, 31 chapter, 810 verses, 26 verses per chapter. 2 Samuel, 24 chapters, 695 verses, 29 verses per chapter. 1 Kings, 22 chapters, 816 verses, 37 verses per chapter. 2 Kings, 25 chapters, 719 verses, 29 verses per chapter. 1 Chronicles, 29 chapters, 942 verses, 32 verses per chapter. 2 Chronicles, 36 chapters, 822 verses, 23 verses per chapter. Ezra, 10 chapters, 280 verses, 28 verses per chapter. Nehemiah, 13 chapters, 406 verses, 31 verses per chapter. Esther, 10 verses, 10 chapters, 167 verses, 17 verses per chapter. Job, 42 chapters, 1070 verses, 25 verses per chapter. Psalms, 150 chapters, 2461 verses, 16 verses per chapter. Proverbs, 31 chapters, 915 verses, 29 verses per chapter. Ecclesiastes, 12 chapters, 222 verses, 18 verses per chapter. Song of Songs, 8 chapters, 117 verses, 15 verses per chapter. Isaiah, 66 chapters, 1292 verses, 20 verses per chapter. Jeremiah, 52 chapters, 1364 verses, 26 verses per chapter. Lamentations, 5 chapters, 154 verses, 31 verses per chapter. Ezekiel, 48 chapters, 1273 verses, 26 verses per chapter. Daniel, 12 chapters, 357 verses, 30 verses per chapter. Hosea, 14 chapters, 197 verses, 14 verses per chapter. Joel, 3 chapters, 73 verses, 24 verses per chapter. Amos, 9 chapters, 146 verses, 16 verses per chapter. Obadiah, 1 chapter, 21 verses, 21 verses. Jonah, 4 chapters, 48 verses, 12 verses per chapter. Micah, 7 chapters, 105 verses, 15 verses per chapter. Nahum, 3 chapters, 47 verses, 16 verses per chapter. Habakkuk, 3 chapters, 56 verses, 19 verses per chapter. Zephaniah, 3 chapters, 53 verses, 18 verses per chapter. Haggai, 2 chapters, 38 verses, 19 verses per chapter. Zechariah, 14 chapters, 211 verses, 15 verses per chapter. Malachi, 4 chapters, 55 verses, 14 verses per chapter. Chapters and verses in the New Testament of the Bible. Matthew, 28 chapters, 1071 verses, 38 verses per chapter. Mark, 16 chapters, 678 verses, 42 chapters. Luke, 42 verses per chapter. Luke, 24 chapters, 1151 verses, 48 verses per chapter. John, 21 chapters, 879 verses, 42 verses per chapter. Acts, 28 chapters, 1007 verses, 36 verses per chapter. Romans, 16 chapters, 433 verses, 27 verses per chapter. 1 Corinthians, 16 chapters, 437 verses, 27 verses per chapter. 2 Corinthians, 13 verses, 257 13 chapters, 257 verses, 20 verses per chapter. Galatians, 6 chapters, 149 verses, 25 verses per chapter. Ephesians, 6 chapters, 155 verses, 26 verses per chapter. Philippians, 4 chapters, 104 verses, 26 verses per chapter. Colossians, 4 chapters, 95 verses, 24 verses per chapter. 1 Thessalonians, 5 chapters, 89 verses, 18 verses per chapter. 2 Thessalonians, 3 chapters, 47 verses, 16 verses per chapter. 1 Timothy, 6 chapters, 113 verses, 19 verses per chapter. 2 Timothy, 4 chapters, 83 verses, 21 verses per chapter. Titus, 3 chapters, 46 verses, 15 verses per chapter. Philemon, 1 chapter, 25 verses. Hebrews, 13 chapters, 303 verses, 23 verses per chapter. James, 5 chapters, 108 verses, 22 verses per chapter. 1 Peter, 5 chapters, 105 verses, 21 verses per chapter. 2 Peter, 3 chapters, 61 verses, 20 verses per chapter. 1 John, 5 chapters, 105 verses, 21 verses per chapter. 2 John, 1 chapter, 13 verses. 3 John, 1 chapter, 14 verses. Jude, 1 chapter, 25 verses. Revelation, 22 chapters, 404 verses, 18 verses per chapter.